Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to another legal breaking reporting video analysis update. Let's get into our first reporting for the morning of Sunday, January 18, 2026, followed by another reporting that was just released by The Hill, stating that the Supreme Court is poised to weigh Trump's powers over the Federal Reserve. Ladies and gentlemen, let's first get into our weekend edition for the Sunday of January 18, 2026. Before we begin, ladies and gentlemen, please like, comment, share, subscribe, as well as enjoy for more legal breaking news that you need to know about on the side of politics and more.
Back to using one of his favorite tools in an attempt to get what he wants. Yesterday, ahead of his trip to the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, Trump announced additional tariffs on 8 NATO members resisting his plans to acquire Greenland. Joining me now is NPR White House correspondent Deepa Shivaram. Good morning, Deepa.
Good morning, Aisha.
So tell us more about these new tariffs.
Yeah, so this is something the president floated Friday for the first time. I was actually at the White House when he said it during this event on rural health care. It was not related to Greenland at all, but he was talking about how he's used tariffs in the past to pressure other countries to work with his agenda. And then he said this.
I may put a tariff on countries if they don't go along with Greenland because we need Greenland for national security. So I may do that.
It was the first time he had said that, and then less than 24 hours later, he elaborated. In a post to social media yesterday, Trump said that Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Finland, which are all NATO allies, I will add, they will face new tariffs on goods sent to the U.S. And Trump says it would start at 10% starting next month, and then increase to 25% in June, unless a deal is reached for the U.S. to purchase Greenland. Now, Trump's rhetoric on Greenland was already complicating relationships with European allies, and his tariff announcement is, as you can imagine, causing more tension.
Ladies and gentlemen, before we continue, I want to note that Congress is going to and has threatened to impeach Trump, with some members of Congress like Representative Senator Don Bacon, who is a Republican, has threatened to sign on to impeach Trump. With that being said, ladies and gentlemen, let's get back into the reporting by NPR.
Davos, like you said, where Trump is probably going to see the leaders of some of these EU nations and European nations. So, in response, the Danish foreign minister said the tariff announcement came as a surprise, and ambassadors from EU nations are convening today in Brussels for an emergency.
Also, on that note, ladies and gentlemen, the tariffs are, in fact, deemed illegal, justified and unjustified by the United States Supreme Court. They are poised to eventually, at some point, issue a ruling on the matter when the Supreme Court justices heard when the Supreme Court justices heard oral arguments on the matter. They seemed skeptical of his ability to unilaterally impose sanctions, when in all reality, ladies and gentlemen, the Congress of the United States of America has the sole power of the purse, which means that they have the sole power to levy tariffs, not the executive branch alone. Let's get back into our reporting, ladies and gentlemen.
Emergency meeting to respond to this.
Does this reach for tariffs mean that Trump is less inclined to use military force like he's threatened?
Yeah, I would say it's a little unclear at this point. And just for context, I mean, this conversation has been going on for months now. Like early on last year is when the president, started bringing this issue up. It's been ongoing. What the president keeps saying is that the U.S. needs Greenland for national security reasons. He says if the U.S. doesn't take this territory, then China or Russia might, and that would give them the advantage.
He is lying point blank, ladies and gentlemen. The United States does not need Greenland whatsoever. The United States has never had control of Greenland, ladies and gentlemen.
The advantage. But Denmark, which is a nation in NATO, again, a really critical alliance, has control of Greenland, and they say they have no intention of giving it up. Leaders in Greenland have said they have no interest in being controlled by the U.S. It just seems like at this point, no matter how much officials in these areas, Greenland, Denmark, other countries, emphasize that the U.S. taking Greenland, whether it's purchasing it or by military force, they say it's unacceptable, and Trump just doesn't seem to want to hear that. And in the meantime, things are tense. European countries, including France and Germany and Sweden, have sent over military units to Greenland to help boost security there.
What are we expecting to hear from the president at this economic forum?
Well, Trump has said in the last few weeks that he intends to announce his plan for more affordable housing while he's at Davos. He says he wants to lower home prices by getting private equity groups out of the housing market. But the rest of the specifics around that plan have not yet been released. And that announcement comes, Aisha, as Trump is trying to tackle other topics around affordability. Remember, it is an election year. Midterms are coming, and the economy remains very top of mind for voters. Last month, there was a number of polls showing that Trump's rating on his handling of the economy have been really low. So he's trying to talk about saving costs. And in addition to talking about housing this coming week, he's also recently announced other plans. Last week, his health care plan was released. It's more of a broad framework, but he says it will reform things like drug pricing. I will say, though, there are criticisms around that plan. Like I said, that it's too broad and that it doesn't do anything to address higher health insurance premiums that a lot of people are paying after Congress denied to extend a provision that would have kept those costs lower. So still some issues to tackle there.
Okay, so finally, stateside, it looks like President Trump may be moving away from his threat to use the Insurrection Act against Minneapolis, where an immigration crackdown has been met with sustained protest. Is it that Trump is focused elsewhere, or are there worries within the administration around public blowback?
Yeah, I mean, look, on Friday, the president said he didn't think he needed to use the Insurrection Act, but I will note that he also said, if he needed it, he would use it. So it's sort of that space where it's possible he's backing down on it. At the same time, it's not clear that he's, ruled it out. But it is interesting to keep in mind that it's something that Trump keeps talking about. The last time a president invoked the Insurrection Act was back in the LA riots in the 90s. I will note, though, several news organizations are reporting that about 1,500 U.S. active duty troops have been ordered to prepare for a possible deployment to Minnesota. NPR, though, has not independently confirmed those reports.
That's NPR's White House correspondent, Deepa Shivaram. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Of President Nicolás Maduro by U.S. Special Forces has raised hopes of a democratic opening in Venezuela. But so far, there's been no Venezuelan spring. That's in part because Maduro's most hardline enforcer remains in power, as John Otis reports.
De los daños Just hours after Maduro was captured, Interior Minister Diosdado Cabello appeared on the streets of Caracas in a helmet and flak jacket. He denounced what he called a terrorist attack, then, along with his security forces, shouted patriotic slogans.
¡Que viva la patria!
Like Maduro, Cabello has been indicted in the U.S. on drug charges. He has a $25 million bounty on his head. Yet Cabello is now a key part of the new Venezuelan government that is making nice with the Trump administration.
Venezuela, Cabello, the de facto number 2 in Venezuela right now, he seemed pretty reluctant to work with the U.S. And obviously
They just gave us 50 million barrels of oil.
The number 2, the Venezuela security.
I don't know. I know the number 1. We just had.
Let's fact check that and back it up there, ladies and gentlemen. They did not give us any barrels. The barrels were illegally stolen because of Donald Trump's bullshit and absolute ridiculous and unconstitutional military action and raid in Venezuela to illegally capture Nicolás Maduro Moros. Ladies and gentlemen, with that being said, let's get back into the reporting.
We just had a great conversation today.
When asked about Cabello at a White House news conference on Wednesday, President Trump didn't seem to recognize his name. But inside Venezuela, Cabello is...
Trump did not recognize his name. That seems like a sign of dementia, ladies and gentlemen. We all know Trump has been sick and is currently sick, ladies and gentlemen. I suspect that he has about maybe 2 months left in the land of the living because of how sick he is, ladies and gentlemen. He's gonna obviously deny it, but we all know the truth, ladies and gentlemen.
Cabello is notorious. A stocky figure with a crew cut, Cabello, 62, was a close confidant of Hugo Chavez, the founder of Venezuela's socialist revolution. As young army officers, the two men took part in a failed 1992 military coup. After they were released from prison, Chavez was elected president, with Cabello becoming part of his inner circle. Cabello even served as interim president for several hours in 2002 when Chavez was ousted in a short-lived coup. When Chavez died of cancer in 2013, Cabello vied with Nicolás Maduro to replace him.
It was an open secret in Venezuela that Diosdado Cabello saw himself as the rightful successor to Hugo Chavez, not Maduro.
That's Jeff Ramsey, a Venezuela analyst at the Atlantic Council. Cabello went on to head Congress and the ruling Socialist Party, but Ramsey says he was kept out of Maduro's cabinet until 2024. That's when protests erupted over allegations that Maduro had stolen that year's presidential election.
Maduro needed to have an enforcer on board to crack heads together and put down the protests in the wake of the stolen election.
Named Interior Minister, Cabello led a crackdown in which 24 people were killed and more than 2,000 arrested, according to human rights groups. Now, under interim President Delcy Rodriguez, he continues in that post, controlling Venezuela's police force as well as armed motorcycle gangs known as colectivos.
Solo él domina la Policía Nacional y los colectivos.
Zair Mundaray is a former Venezuelan public prosecutor. He says the stable business climate sought by the Trump administration to exploit Venezuelan oil won't happen as long as Cabello remains in the picture. How can you have legal stability when you have this guy who has armed thugs in the streets and who can create chaos and jail or kidnap people whenever he wants, Mundaray says. Human rights activists blame Cabello for delays in the release of political prisoners, a government policy announced to foment national unity. In addition, Cabello continues to slam dissidents on his weekly TV program.
Parte de las acusaciones que hace esta fugitiva de la justicia venezolana, María Corina Machado.
Here he is on the latest edition describing opposition leader and Nobel Peace Prize recipient Maria Corina Machado as a fugitive from Venezuelan justice. Not surprisingly, opposition figures who fled the country say it will be too dangerous to return as long as Cabello remains a key power broker.
Right now, I cannot go back.
That's Venezuelan economist Ricardo Hausman speaking on a panel at Harvard University.
You have the colectivos in the streets. You have Diosdado Cabello as the head of police. So the government in Venezuela is the same Chavista government we saw before.
All this could further delay a transition to democracy that the Trump administration says it is also seeking. Trump has warned of a second wave of military strikes should Maduro holdovers like Cabello step out of line. Cabello could try to cut a deal and go into exile. Or, as Ramsey of the Atlantic Council says, he could lie low, cooperate with the interim government, and try to outlast Trump.
If he expects to stay out of prison and avoid Maduro's fate, his best opportunity lies in coordinating with Delcy Rodriguez, at least for now. But that doesn't mean that he's going to give up his long-standing ambitions.
For NPR News, I'm John Otis.
With that being said, ladies and gentlemen, let's get into our third reporting for the morning.
A New Hampshire Episcopal bishop has issued a stark warning to his clergy who protest against ICE. Get your affairs in order and your wills ready. The comments quickly went viral, resonating with many and prompting rebukes from others, as NPR's Tovia Smith reports.
Bishop Rob Hirschfeld was one of several community and faith leaders speaking in New Hampshire at a dark, rainy vigil for Renee Macklin Good, just days after she was fatally shot by an ICE agent in Minneapolis.
We are now, I believe, entering a new era of martyrdom.
Hirschfeld called out the, quote, cruelty, the injustice, and the horror unleashed in Minneapolis and implored his clergy to be prepared for more.
And I've asked them to get their affairs in order, to make sure they have their wills written, because it may be that now is no longer the time for statements, but for us with our bodies to stand between the powers of this world and the most vulnerable.
I was actually quite surprised to open up my phone and find my social media blowing up with my own bishop on it.
The Reverend Jason Wells of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church in Goffstown, New Hampshire, is one of many relieved to hear the bishop speaking openly about the mounting anxiety among faith leaders who are stepping up their public prayers and protests against ICE and are getting pelted with pepper rounds, roughed up, and arrested.
People feel like he is giving voice to a sort of feeling in the pit of their stomach about what's going on.
Similar amens came from clergy like the Reverend Betsy Hess of St. Barnabas Episcopal Church in Berlin, New Hampshire. She immediately emailed the bishop to thank him.
I said, oh my God, I'm so glad you did this. You know, we need to quit just kind of being polite Episcopalians and get out there and do stuff.
But what kind of stuff and what level of risk she's willing to take is something Hess is still figuring out.
I mean, it used to be that would be what it was. You'd be knowing that you'd go to jail. Now you might get shot. So it makes us need to be a lot more brave. And I hope I would be brave, but I can't promise that I would be able to. But definitely it's time to move beyond, I won't do anything that has any risk whatsoever.
Not everyone, however, welcomed the bishop's words.
My initial reaction is, oh boy, this isn't diffusing the tension at all. This feels like a war cry.
That's the Reverend Tom Garton of Faith Episcopal Church, who heard the bishop's comments from his parish in California.
I didn't sign up to be a martyr. You know, I have a family. I have a congregation who rely on me. And if I was gone tomorrow, what would happen to them?
Garton also bristles at the idea of a preacher calling for physical resistance, making the case that mere statements no longer move the needle one bit, as the bishop put it. Garton calls that inflammatory and at odds with one of Episcopalians' guiding tenets that calls for finding a path between extremes.
We're called to do the work of peacemaking and to de-escalate the tension that we see all around us, because it doesn't serve anyone to become the next victim, but it does serve everyone to build the next bridge.
In no way did I intend anything that I said to be insightful of violence or to invite it.
In an interview with NPR, Hirschfeld said he understands how some may be hearing his words in ways he didn't intend, but he stands by his message.
What I just said to the clergy, I'm just asking you to live your life without fear of death. Be prepared. I'm not asking you to go look for that bullet. I'm simply saying, be ready. Have your affairs in order. Have your soul ready in case you find yourself in trouble.
That, Hirschfeld says, is in the Episcopal tradition. He pointed to several church activists who became martyrs, including Jonathan Daniels, a New Hampshire native who took a bullet to protect a black teenager in Alabama in 1965. Today, Hirschfeld says, we're increasingly called to go into places that feel dangerous, like public demonstrations against ICE.
I see people with guns in New Hampshire. This is an open carry state. So it doesn't necessarily lend itself to a feeling of security and safety. But does that mean I shouldn't show up? I don't think so. I think it means I go. And it means I should be prepared for whatever happens.
A White House spokeswoman said interfering with federal law enforcement is a crime and will be prosecuted. The administration maintains that the ICE agent who shot Renee Macklin Good was acting in self-defense. DHS spokeswoman Tricia McLaughlin called Hirschfeld's comments about martyrdom absurd, saying the real vulnerable ones are the ICE agents who are under attack. For his part, Hirschfeld says he does feel compassion for those agents. It's our Christian responsibility, he says, to love all God's children, even those who could be perceived as an enemy. Tovia Smith, NPR News.
With that being said, ladies and gentlemen, Jonathan Ross was completely and illegally in the wrong for what he did. It is against DOJ policy as well as the law of the land of the United States of America and federal law to shoot at a moving vehicle, which is what Nicole Macklin Good was doing before she was shot to death by Jonathan Ross. She wasn't trying to kill him or anything. She literally said point blank, "That's fine, dude, I'm not mad at you." And seconds later, she was shot dead. For what? For what? For exercising one of her constitutional rights? Jonathan Ross is a point-blank murderer and will be sentenced, hopefully, to death. That is actually what I am calling for Minnesota state officials to do, is sentence Jonathan Ross to death. Ladies and gentlemen, with that being said, let's get into our last reporting, read by an automated voice by The Hill. So we will be taking a look, a read, as well as a listen. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let's get into it.
Supreme Court prepares to weigh Trump's power over Federal Reserve. By Zach Schoenfeld. President Trump's power over the Federal Reserve will be front and center at the Supreme Court next week. The justices on Wednesday will hear arguments on whether Trump can fire Fed Governor Lisa Cook over accusations of mortgage fraud. Looming over it all is the Justice Department's criminal investigation into Jerome Powell, the Fed's chair, which came into public view last weekend, testing the bounds of Trump's power. In his second term, Trump has looked to reshape independent agencies that have long enjoyed protections that prevent the president from firing those who lead them on a whim. Trump argues it infringes on his constitutional authority to oversee the executive branch, part of an expansive view of presidential power known as the unitary executive theory. Once Trump controls a majority of the Fed, he can use the Fed's vast powers to enrich himself personally, to reward his billionaire friends, and to punish his enemies. Senator Elizabeth Warren, Democrat from Massachusetts, a critic of Powell's who has defended him against Trump's firing threats, told reporters that has been his strategy across the government. The Supreme Court's conservative majority has appeared sympathetic to Trump's efforts to eviscerate firing protections at other independent agencies, like the Federal Trade Commission and National Labor Relations Board. But the justices have suggested they view the Fed as possessing special status that could justify the protections. The Federal Reserve is a uniquely structured, quasi-private entity that follows in the distinct historical tradition of the first and second banks of the United States. The court wrote in an unsigned May opinion, Trump has appeared to take note of the signals. Powell remains in his job despite Trump's months-long public musings that he may fire the central bank chief and repeated condemnations for not lowering interest rates faster. And in terminating Cook, rather than arguing her firing restriction is unconstitutional, the president purports to have valid cause, mortgage fraud, that follows the statute. For cause, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 prevents the president from firing the central bank's governors except for cause. The law does not, however, explicitly define what cause means. Trump is the first president to fire a sitting Fed governor. Making it an unanswered question, the Supreme Court is now poised to review. The language for cause is a legal term of art. It has to be cashed out. Lev Menand, a Columbia Law School professor who previously worked at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, said on a press briefing, all sides agree Trump cannot terminate Cook merely over her vote on interest rates. Trump fired Cook over accusations of mortgage fraud, saying she falsely listed an Atlanta property as her primary residence to gain favorable mortgage terms. Cook's lawyers have described it as an inadvertent notation and deny she had any intent to defraud. The Justice Department will argue Wednesday that Trump has discretion to remove Fed governors for reasons related to their conduct. Ability, fitness, or competence. The president's removal of Cook for her material misrepresentation and, at minimum, gross negligence in financial transactions easily qualifies, Solicitor General D. John Sauer wrote in court filings. Sauer on Wednesday will argue the case for the government. Cook will be represented by Paul Clement, one of Sauer's predecessors who served under former President George W. Bush. The conservative lawyer has represented several other clients opposing Trump administration efforts. Clement represents Wilmer Hale in its fight against Trump's executive order targeting the law firm and education groups in their fights against federal research grant cuts. Cook's team has argued that the mortgage fraud accusations are untested and involve conduct before she was appointed to the Fed. They also contend she was entitled to a hearing under due process protections in the Constitution and federal law. Trump's boundless interpretation of for cause would destroy the Federal Reserve's historic independence. Cook's team wrote in court filings, Cook's position is supported by former Fed chairs Ben Bernanke, Alan Greenspan, and Janet Yellen. They submitted a joint written brief that also included former Treasury Secretaries Tim Geithner, Jack Lew, Hank Paulson, Robert Rubin, and Larry Summers, allowing the government to remove a member of the Board of Governors for the first time in the nation's history, while under the cloud of legal challenge, will erode public confidence in the Fed's independence and threaten the long-term stability of our economy. Their filing reads, Trump's appeal garnered support from the America First Legal Foundation and the Libertarian New Civil Liberties Alliance. 22 Republican state attorneys general are backing the administration, while 23 Democratic state attorneys general are backing Cook. Powell investigation intensifies. Trump's quest to exert greater control over the Fed has taken another twist in the days leading up to Wednesday's argument. Last week, Powell announced that the Justice Department had issued a subpoena as part of a criminal investigation. The probe stems from Powell's Senate Banking Committee testimony last June over renovations to the Fed's headquarters. The project, initially estimated to cost $1.9 billion, has risen to $2.5 billion. The central bank has cited higher costs for materials, equipment, and labor, design changes, and unforeseen conditions. Those are pretexts, Powell said of the investigation in a video statement. The threat of criminal charges is a consequence of the Federal Reserve setting interest rates based on our best assessment of what will serve the public, rather than following the preferences of the president. The investigation came to light after written briefing concluded in Cook's Supreme Court case. But the issue could now come up at Wednesday's oral arguments. Powell's term as Fed chair ends May 15th. It may come before a decision in Cook's case, which is expected by the end of June. Though he could step down entirely, his seat on the Fed's governing board extends through January 2028.
With that being said, ladies, that right there is going to do it for this morning's legal breaking reportings and video analysis updates. Ladies and gentlemen, before we cut out the reporting, please like, comment, share, subscribe, and enjoy, as well as subscribe for more legal breaking news that you need to know about and more on the side of politics. I will see you guys back here in about an hour and a half for our 5th legal breaking reporting video analysis update for the morning of Sunday, January 18, 2026. Ladies and gentlemen, the next reporting will be the last reporting for the morning hours of January 18, Sunday, 2026. See you in about an hour and a half for the fifth and final reporting, ladies and gentlemen.